The cowboy reached for the bride's veil with steady hands until he saw what the fire had left behind. Mud splashed against the stagecoach wheels as the whole town fell silent. One horse snorted sharply in the cold morning air. The woman stepped down, clutching a worn suitcase, snow melting on the black lace covering half her face. Then the cowboy lifted the veil and forgot every word he'd practiced on the ride there. She noticed the hesitation immediately, and before anyone else could speak, she quietly offered to leave. If stories like this still find a place in your heart, stay with us tonight. The February wind moved low across Dust River, dragging snow dust along the empty street like pale smoke. Coulter Hayes stood outside the stage depot, with his gloves tucked beneath one arm and his pocket watch open in his hand. 6:43, late again. Across the road, the windows of Murphy's saloon glowed amber through the morning frost. A few ranch hands leaned near the porch rail with coffee tins in their hands, watching him the way men watched a hanging before it started. Mail-order brides were still entertainment in towns like Dust River, especially when a wealthy rancher was involved. Coulter snapped the watch shut and slipped it back into his coat pocket. His breath drifted white in front of him. Behind him, tied near the hitching rail, his black gelding stamped impatiently against the frozen ground. Stone Creek Ranch sat 12 miles north beyond the cottonwoods and frozen creek beds. Big house, too many empty rooms, too much silence. 3 years ago, there had been laughter there. Then scarlet fever came through Colorado territory like a curse with no face. Now there was only dust on the piano and one untouched side of the bed. The stagecoach finally appeared through the gray morning haze. The horses came first, then the wheels, then the whole heavy shape rolling toward town under a coat of road mud and snow. One of the men outside Murphy's grinned. "Hope she ain't got whiskers, Hayes." A few laughed. Coulter ignored them. The stagecoach pulled to a stop hard enough to rattle the windows of the depot. The driver climbed down stiffly, muttering about frozen roads near Silver Pass. Then the door opened. A woman stepped out carefully, one gloved hand gripping the frame. Black coat, small brown suitcase, dark veil pinned beneath a weather-worn hat. She stood still for a second, after touching the ground, like someone listening for danger before taking another step. The town quieted. Coulter walked forward. "Miss Cole?" Her voice came soft beneath the veil. "Mr. Hayes." Up close, he noticed the gloves, first mended twice at the fingertips, then the suitcase. Corners worn white from years of use. She reached slowly for the edge of the veil and lifted it. The scar ran from the corner of her mouth toward her ear, pale against the winter light. Not fresh. Old enough to have settled into her skin like something permanent. One side of her face remained delicate and untouched. The other carried fire. Someone near the saloon let out a low whistle. Another man laughed under his breath. Coulter froze. Not because she frightened him, because he had not prepared himself to see pain worn so openly on another human being. The silence stretched too long. Vivian Cole noticed. Women like her always noticed. Something in her expression closed quietly behind her eyes. "The agency didn't describe me honestly," she said. "If you'd prefer to end the arrangement now, I can take the eastbound coach tomorrow." The driver avoided looking at her entirely. A woman exiting the bakery across the street turned away fast, pretending not to stare. Coulter looked down at Vivian's suitcase again. Small enough for a person who never expected to stay anywhere long. Then he looked back at her. Snow caught against the loose strands of dark hair near her cheek. "Stone Creek doesn't send people back out in weather like this," he said. The men outside Murphy's exchanged looks. Vivian blinked once, surprised despite herself. Coulter reached for her suitcase. "It's a long ride north," he added. "Road gets rough after the ridge." For a second she said nothing, then she nodded once. The wagon wheels cracked over frozen mud as they left Dust River behind. Neither spoke much. The horses breathed steam into the cold afternoon. while pine-covered hills rolled past beneath a dull winter sky. Vivian sat carefully at the far edge of the wagon seat. One hand stayed folded in her lap the entire ride. Coulter noticed she always angled the scarred side of her face away whenever a wagon passed. Habit, not vanity, something sadder. By the time Stone Creek Ranch appeared beyond the trees, daylight had already begun fading blue across the snow. The ranch house stood broad and lonely against the open land. Smoke drifted from the chimney. The barn lantern glowed faint gold near the corrals. Vivian studied the place quietly. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. Coulter climbed down first and offered a hand. She hesitated before taking it. Her fingers were cold even through the gloves. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar wood and old coffee grounds. No warmth beyond necessity, no softness. Vivian removed her coat slowly while Coulter lit another lamp near the kitchen. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," he said. "You can choose whichever. The room beside the kitchen is fine." He looked toward the narrow little door near the pantry. "That used to belong to the cook." "It's warm," she replied, "and close to the stove." He should have argued harder, should have insisted. Instead, he only nodded once. All right. That seemed to settle something inside her. She carried her own suitcase into the small room without another word. Later that evening, they ate stew in near silence, at opposite ends of the long kitchen table. Wind pressed softly against the windows. The marriage certificate sat folded near the lamp between them, unsigned. Vivian noticed it once, then lowered her eyes again. Coulter talked about the ranch because he didn't know what else to say. North pasture fencing, cattle prices in Denver, a broken water pump near the south field. Vivian listened politely. Nothing more. When supper ended, she washed her own plate immediately and disappeared behind the small kitchen door. Coulter remained alone at the table long after the fire burned low. The house felt different already. Not warmer, just less empty. Near midnight, Vivian stood inside the little room beside the kitchen wearing only her white undershift. The cracked mirror hanging beside the bed reflected half her face clearly. The other half looked broken by the slit running through the glass. Slowly, she removed the scarf from her hair. Her fingers brushed the scar automatically. Outside, wind rattled the loose porch gate. Vivian stared at herself for a long time before speaking softly enough that only the room could hear. 1 week, she whispered. Then she lowered her eyes. 1 week, then I'll keep moving. Morning came hard and white across Stone Creek Ranch. Frost clung to the fence posts. The pump beside the barn groaned every time the hired hands hauled water from the frozen ground. Somewhere beyond the corrals, cattle bawled low through the cold. Coulter woke before sunrise out of habit. For a moment he forgot there was someone else in the house. Then he smelled coffee. Real coffee, fresh ground. He stopped halfway down the stairs. The kitchen glowed amber beneath the oil lamp. Vivian stood near the stove in a plain dark dress with her sleeves rolled back. Steam curled around her as she stirred something inside a cast-iron pot. She glanced up briefly. Morning. Her voice carried no awkwardness from the day before, no complaint either, just tired politeness. Coulter noticed the table first. Clean, not simply wiped down, scrubbed. The coffee tin had been moved beside the stove instead of left open near the sink where he always forgot it. 2 chipped plates sat warming near the fire. "You didn't have to start this early," he said. The dough needed time to rise. She said it like the answer should been obvious. Outside, boots crossed the porch. 2 ranch hands entered carrying cold air with them. One was Walter Boone, gray-bearded and broad through the shoulders despite his age. The other was a skinny teenager named Luke Mercer, who handled most of the feed buckets. Both men stopped short when they saw Vivian. Walter recovered first. "Morning, Mom." Vivian nodded politely and slid a plate toward him before he could ask. "Biscuits. Actual biscuits." Luke stared openly until Walter elbowed him hard enough to nearly knock his hat off. The boy muttered an apology and sat down fast. Coulter poured coffee into a tin cup and watched quietly while Vivian moved around the kitchen with calm efficiency, not nervous, not eager to impress. Like she had spent years learning how to enter strange places without expecting welcome. By noon, the curtains in the front room had disappeared. Coulter found Vivian outside near the clothesline shaking dust from faded blue fabric. "You taking those down?" They were stiff as saddle blankets. He looked up toward the bare windows. "You sew? My mother taught me before." She stopped herself gently. Before she died, the wind lifted loose strands of dark hair across her face. Automatically, she turned the scarred side away. Coulter noticed. He noticed every time now. That evening, snow began falling again, slow at first, then thicker. After supper, Coulter walked into the barn carrying a lantern and found Vivian kneeling beside old Maggie, the ranch's oldest mare. The horse stamped nervously, while Vivian cleaned a swollen cut near the animal's leg. "You shouldn't kneel that close," Coulter warned. "She bites when strangers touch her." Vivian kept working. She already tried. Coulter looked closer. A fresh tear marked the edge of Vivian's glove. Maggie lowered her head against Vivian's shoulder with a tired breath. "Well," Coulter muttered, "guess she likes you better than most people do." Vivian almost smiled at that. Almost. The next few days slipped into rhythm. Small things changed around Stone Creek. A loose cabinet hinge got repaired. The mudroom floor stopped collecting dirty boot prints because someone laid old feed sacks near the door. Warm bread started appearing beside supper, without explanation. One evening, Coulter came in from checking north fences and found his winter coat folded neatly over a chair. The torn sleeve had been stitched closed so carefully he almost couldn't find the repair. He ran his thumb over the seam. Vivian sat near the lamp darning socks. "You fixed it. It was catching cold air. That coat's near 10 years old. That's why I fixed it twice." The corner of his mouth moved before he could stop it. Vivian noticed. So did he. Saturday brought supply wagons through Dust River. By afternoon, gossip rode faster than horses. At Murphy's saloon, men laughed over whiskey. Herd Hayes bought himself a bride who scares mirrors. At the mercantile, Mrs. Hartwell lowered her voice dramatically while measuring flour. Poor thing. Imagine living like that. By Sunday, half the territory had opinions about Vivian Cole without ever speaking to her once. Stone Creek stayed quiet. That afternoon, Coulter found a boy sitting backward on the ranch fence near the barn. Ely Turner, 10 years old, freckles, missing 2 front teeth. The child squinted toward the house. "That your new wife?" Coulter rested his arms on the fence rail. "Suppose it is. She pretty?" Coulter opened his mouth, then stopped. The boy shrugged before he could answer. "My pa says scars mean somebody survived something." He hopped down and ran toward the bunkhouse before Coulter could respond. Near dusk, Vivian stepped outside, carrying a basket of feed scraps toward the chickens. The wind caught her scarf loose from her hair. For a second, the scar showed fully in the fading light. Eli looked straight at her. Didn't flinch, didn't stare. He only held out the broken latch from the chicken coop and said, "Think you could fix this?" Vivian blinked once in surprise, then took the latch from his hand. "I think so." That night, the storm finally hit hard. Snow slammed against the ranch house windows. Wind screamed down from the hills, strong enough to shake the porch rails. Near midnight, someone pounded on Coulter's bedroom door. Walter Boone stood there, half-dressed in long johns and boots, the brindle cows calving wrong. By the time they reached the barn, snow already covered the yard ankle-deep. Inside, lantern light swung wildly against the walls. Vivian was already there, kneeling in straw, one sleeve soaked through. The newborn calf lay half out, struggling weakly while the mother kicked in panic. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" Coulter shouted over the storm. Vivian didn't look up. "Pull when I say." The next hour passed in sweat, mud, and freezing wind leaking through the barn boards. Finally, the calf slid free into the straw, alive, barely. Vivian wrapped it in old blankets with shaking hands. Only then did Coulter realize she was burning with fever. She tried standing once, nearly collapsed. Without thinking, Coulter caught her. Vivian's fingers clutched the front of his coat hard enough to wrinkle the wool. For one strange second, she held onto him like someone terrified of falling into deep water. Then her eyes closed. Coulter lifted her carefully into his arms while snow roared outside the barn doors, and all the way back to the house he could feel her trembling against his chest. The storm trapped Stone Creek Ranch for 3 straight days. Snow buried the fence lines. The north gate disappeared completely beneath white drifts taller than a horse's shoulder. Wind rattled the windows through the night, like someone trying to force their way inside. Vivian spent the first day in bed with fever. Coulter moved quietly around the kitchen below her room, awkward in ways he had never been around cattle or men or hard weather. He burned bacon twice trying to make breakfast before Walter Boone finally shoved him aside with a curse and took over the stove himself. "She nearly froze saving your calf," Walter muttered. "Least you can do is stop poisoning the woman." Coulter carried coffee upstairs anyway. Vivian sat propped against folded quilts near the window, pale from fever but awake. Morning light softened the scar along her cheek into something almost silver. "You should still be resting," he said. "You say that like resting changes chores." He handed her the coffee carefully. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Neither mentioned it. By the second night, the fever finally broke. The storm outside worsened instead. With nowhere to ride and no fence work possible, the ranch settled into an unfamiliar stillness. Walter and the ranch hands stayed mostly inside the bunkhouse playing cards while the house belonged to Coulter and Vivian alone. That evening, she found an old checkerboard tucked beneath the parlor cabinet. "You play?" she asked. "Badly. That makes 2 of us." They sat near the fireplace while snow battered the windows. Vivian lost 3 games in a row. "You're cheating," she accused quietly. "I'm not nearly smart enough for that." A tiny laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Coulter looked up sharply. It was the first real laugh he had heard from her, not polite, not guarded, warm. For a moment neither moved. The fire cracked softly between them. Then Vivian lowered her eyes toward the checkerboard again, like she regretted letting the sound out. On the 3rd morning, the storm finally eased. Weak sunlight filtered across the frozen ranch yard. Vivian stood near the kitchen counter, slicing potatoes while humming under her breath. Some old melody Coulter didn't recognize. He paused in the doorway, listening. She noticed after a moment and stopped immediately. "Sorry, don't." She looked up. He cleared his throat roughly. "House sounds better with noise in it." Something gentle crossed her face before disappearing again. Later that afternoon, they walked together to the barn to check the animals. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The air smelled clean and sharp after the storm. Inside the barn, Maggie shoved her nose against Vivian's shoulder until she laughed again softly. "She likes you more every day," Coulter said. "She likes whoever brings apples. She tried to bite me last winter. You probably deserved it." That earned another smile. Real this time. Sunlight slipped through the wooden slats overhead, catching loose strands of hair near her cheek. For once, she wasn't hiding the scar from him. Coulter found himself staring too long again. Vivian noticed, but this time she didn't turn away. The silence between them changed. Not empty anymore. Something slower, more dangerous. A week later, spring began touching the valley in small ways. Snow melted off the lower hills first. Mud replaced frost along the wagon paths. The creek behind the barn started running louder every afternoon. Vivian planted herbs beside the kitchen steps in cracked ceramic pots she found in storage. Sage, thyme, wild mint. The ranch workers started lingering longer at supper. Someone always laughed now. One morning, Coulter rode into Dust River alone, and came back carrying a brown paper package tied with string. He left it beside Vivian's sewing basket without explanation. She opened it carefully. Blue fabric, soft calico with tiny white flowers stitched along the edge. New, not second-hand, not mended. New. Vivian touched it with both hands like she didn't trust it to stay real. You didn't have to buy this. Coulter shrugged while hanging his hat near the door. Thought maybe you ought to own something pretty. Her throat moved once. No one had said something like that to her in years. Maybe ever. That night she stayed awake late near the lamp cutting careful pattern pieces from the fabric, while Coulter pretended to read cattle invoices nearby. Mostly he watched her. The concentration in her face. The loose strand of dark hair falling against her cheek. The scar he no longer noticed first. Outside, coyotes somewhere far across the valley. Inside, the house glowed warm. By April, mornings at Stone Creek had settled into habits that felt strangely natural. Coffee already brewing, Vivian handing him gloves before he stepped outside. Coulter bringing extra firewood in without being asked because he noticed her cough in cold weather. Small things, dangerous things. One evening, they sat outside the barn while the sky burned orange behind the mountains. Vivian leaned against the fence rail beside him, watching the horses move through the pasture. Mud splashed suddenly from beneath Maggie's hoof straight onto Coulter's shirt. Vivian burst into laughter, full laughter this time. Head tilted back, eyes bright. Coulter stared at her like a man seeing sunlight after years underground. Slowly, almost without thinking, he reached toward her face. His fingers brushed the scar near her cheekbone. Vivian went still, but she didn't pull away. His thumb traced lightly along the pale edge of old fire. Her breathing changed. So did his. He leaned closer. Close enough to feel warmth against the cold evening air. Then, his hand brushed something hard inside his coat pocket, the old silver pocket watch, the one Sarah had given him before she died. Everything inside him tightened, just for a second. Just one heartbeat, but Vivian felt it, the hesitation, the fear, the memory of another woman suddenly standing between them. She stepped back first. Coulter opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Vivian folded her arms against the cold. I should start supper. Her voice sounded smaller now. By nightfall, she had moved back into the little room beside the kitchen. The blue dress remained unfinished across the chair, and when Coulter came downstairs the next morning, he found the coffee pot already made, but no second cup waiting beside it anymore. The house felt careful again, quiet in the wrong way. Vivian moved through the kitchen, without humming now. She kept her sleeves buttoned tight at the wrists and spoke only when necessary. Every word sounded measured before it left her mouth. Walter Boone noticed by supper. He glanced once between them while chewing salt pork and said nothing at all. That was worse. Outside, spring rain softened the roads leading into Dust River. Wagon wheels left deep grooves through the mud. The creek behind the barn swelled brown and fast with snowmelt from the hills. Inside Stone Creek, distance settled room by room. Vivian stopped, leaving the lamp lit for him at night. Coulter stopped lingering near the kitchen doorway, pretending to look for things he didn't need. The unfinished blue dress remained folded across the chair upstairs like proof of something that almost happened. 3 days later, Gideon Burke rode into the yard just before noon. Even his horse looked expensive. Tall gray gelding, silver saddle trim, polished boots without a speck of mud on them. Coulter saw him first from the fence line and swore under his breath. Gideon dismounted slowly outside the porch. Vivian opened the door before Coulter could reach the house. Well, Gideon drawled, removing his gloves one finger at a time. Dust River's been talking about you for months. Thought I ought to finally see if the stories were true. Vivian kept one hand on the doorframe. If you came to buy cattle, mister, Hayes is outside. Gideon's eyes moved across her scar openly, not shocked, not pitying, worse, amused. I didn't come for cattle. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. $500, he said. Enough to get yourself someplace warmer than Colorado. California, maybe. Oregon if you like rain. Vivian didn't touch it. Gideon rested the envelope on the porch rail anyway. A woman ought to know when she's being tolerated instead of loved. The words landed soft. That made them crueler. He keeps you here because decent men feel guilty easy. But guilt fades. Gideon smiled faintly. Sooner or later, men look where they really want to. Vivian's fingers tightened against the doorframe. Get off this ranch. Think about the offer first. Coulter's voice came cold from behind him. I said, get off my property. Gideon turned slowly. Rain tapped steady against the porch roof. For a second, the two men simply stared at each other. Then Gideon smiled again. Careful, Hayes. You look almost jealous. He rode out, laughing softly to himself. The envelope stayed on the rail, long after he disappeared down the road. Vivian finally picked it up, not to keep, only to carry it inside out of the rain. That evening the sky darkened early. Thunder rolled far off beyond the hills, while Coulter spent 12 straight hours helping Walter separate mixed cattle near the flooded creek crossing. By the time he returned home, soaked and exhausted, mud covered his boots nearly to the knee. The kitchen lamp still burned. Vivian stood beside the table, folding clothes into her suitcase. Coulter stopped cold. What are you doing? She kept folding. Careful, precise. The same way she stitched torn fabric, answering a question for myself. His chest tightened. What question? Vivian closed the suitcase halfway before speaking. Whether I should stayed after winter ended. Rain hammered the windows harder now. Coulter removed his hat slowly. You're leaving? I think maybe I never really arrived. That hit harder than anger would have. He walked closer. Vivian, do you regret it? He frowned. The arrangement, marrying me, bringing me here. She finally looked at him fully. Do you regret it? Coulter's head throbbed from exhaustion. The day had wrung him dry. His thoughts tangled together with Sarah's memory, and Gideon's smirk, and the sight of Vivian pulling away more each morning. He rubbed one hand across his face. Maybe this whole thing should never happened. The second the words left his mouth, he saw it, the damage. Vivian went completely still, not dramatic, not loud, just still in the terrible way a door goes still after it closes for good. He tried again. That's not what I meant. But it's what you said. Vivian, you don't have to explain. She shut the suitcase. The sound snapped through the room, sharper than thunder. Coulter stared at her helplessly. What he meant was the contract, the fear, the pretending, the way he kept reaching for her while still living beside a ghost. But none of that mattered now, because what she heard was simple. You were a mistake. Rainwater dripped through the brim of his hat onto the floorboards. Vivian picked up the folded blue dress from the chair nearby and placed it carefully beside the suitcase, still unfinished. I'll leave before sunrise, she said quietly. Coulter should have stopped her. Instead, he stood there trapped inside himself again. Same fear, same hesitation, same silence that ruined everything it touched. That night, he slept badly on top of the blankets without removing his boots. Near dawn, he heard the front door open softly downstairs. Then close. Nothing else. No goodbye. By the time he reached the porch, Vivian was already halfway down the muddy road with the suitcase in one hand, and her dark coat pulled tight against the wind. She never looked back. Coulter stood there until the shape of her disappeared into the gray morning rain. The house behind him settled into silence again. Not the old silence. Worse. Because now he knew exactly what was missing. 3 days later, the coffee tasted burnt, no matter how carefully he made it. The kitchen's cold. No humming. No lamp in the window. The unfinished blue dress remained folded on the chair upstairs. And every time Coulter passed it, the house seemed to accuse him quietly without saying a word. By the end of the week, Stone Creek Ranch no longer felt like a home. It felt abandoned. Coulter stopped shaving. Coffee burned black in the pot nearly every morning, because he forgot it sitting over the stove. One night, Walter Boone found him asleep in the barn, with his coat still on and rain dripping through the roof beside him. Walter kicked his boot hard against a fence post. "You planning on dying, stupid?" Coulter rubbed both hands over his face. "She's gone. That woman walked out because you handed her the door." Walter's voice carried no comfort in it, just truth. Rain tapped steady against the barn roof while horses shifted in their stalls nearby. Coulter stared at the muddy floor. "I didn't know how to let her in," Walter snorted. "No, you knew exactly how." He stepped closer. "You just got scared the minute it started mattering." The old rancher jabbed a finger toward him. "You buried yourself with Sarah 3 years ago. Vivian's just the first thing alive that's tried dragging you back out." Those words stayed with him all night. The next morning, Coulter rode alone to the cemetery north of Dust River. Cold wind moved through the hill grass, while clouds rolled low over the valley. Sarah's grave sat beneath a crooked cedar tree near the fence line, the headstone worn pale by weather. Coulter stood there a long time before speaking. "I thought loving somebody twice meant betraying you." His voice sounded rough in the empty air. "But I think I've just been hiding behind you instead." A crow called somewhere across the hills. He took Sarah's old silver watch from his pocket and looked down at it. For years he had carried it like proof of loyalty. Now it suddenly felt heavier than iron. "She makes the house breathe again," he whispered, "and I let fear tell her she wasn't enough." The wind shifted cold against his face. For the first time in years, Coulter cried where nobody could see him. Meanwhile, Vivian sat beside the boarding house window above Mrs. Campbell's dry goods store, with a train ticket folded in her lap. California. Departure Sunday evening. Outside, Dust River carried on as usual. Wagons rolled through mud. Church bells rang faint and distant through the gray afternoon. Men laughed outside Murphy's saloon, like the world had never broken anybody. Mrs. Hartwell had already arranged work for Vivian caring for an elderly widow near Sacramento. Safe work, she'd called it. Quiet work. Vivian understood what that really meant. Small work, hidden work, a life where no one had to look directly at her. She folded the ticket once more between her fingers, then tore it clean down the middle. Her own breath shook afterward, not from fear, from exhaustion. Running had become another kind of prison. Sunday morning arrived bright after rain. The whole town gathered at church in stiff collars and polished boots. Muddy wagon wheels lined the road outside, while women carried casserole dishes beneath white cloth covers. Vivian stood near the back pew with her suitcase beside her boots. She planned to leave Dust River after service ended. No farewell, no scene, just another disappearing. Reverend Pike had barely begun the sermon when the church doors burst open hard enough to rattle the stained glass. Every head turned. Coulter Hayes stood there, breathing hard, coat dusty from hard riding, hair windblown, eyes red with exhaustion. Silence spread fast through the church. Gideon Burke leaned back in his pew with slow amusement curling at the corner of his mouth. Coulter ignored everyone. He walked straight down the center aisle toward Vivian, boot steps loud against old wooden floors. Vivian stared at him without moving. Up close, he looked wrecked, like a man who had spent days losing an argument with himself. He stopped in front of her. "Vivian." Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. "You shouldn't be here. I should have been here days ago." Whispers stirred through the pews. Mrs. Hartwell pressed one hand against her chest dramatically. Coulter looked at Vivian like the rest of the church no longer existed. "I was afraid," he said plainly. "That's the truth of it." Vivian swallowed once but said nothing. "I thought if I kept part of myself closed off, maybe losing somebody wouldn't hurt so bad again." His jaw tightened. "Then you walked into Stone Creek and made the whole place feel alive." Gideon gave a quiet scoff from across the aisle. Coulter finally turned toward the congregation. All of you saw her scars before you saw anything else. Nobody spoke, whispered about her in stores, on sidewalks, in this very church. His voice sharpened. But that woman crossed half the country alone with more courage than most people in this town have shown their entire lives. Vivian's eyes filled suddenly. Coulter stepped closer. I looked at your scars, he said softly to her now, and all I could think was how hard you fought to survive them. The church stayed perfectly still. Even Gideon stopped smiling. Vivian's voice trembled when she finally spoke. You let me leave. Pain crossed his face immediately. Worst mistake I ever made. You made me think I was something to regret. No, he shook his head hard. Never you, never. Emotion thickened his voice. I regret every moment I let fear speak louder than love. The silence inside the church turned heavy enough to feel. Coulter slowly held out his hand, not demanding, not certain, just honest. Vivian looked down at it for a long moment. Then, at the people watching, at Gideon Burke, at Mrs. Hartwell, at the whole town that had taught her to hide her face every chance she got. Slowly, Vivian removed the scarf from around her hair. Gasps moved softly through the pews as the scar caught the morning light fully uncovered. Her chin lifted, and then she placed her hand in Coulter's. Warm, steady, unashamed. Old Walter Boone started clapping first from the back row. One sharp clap, then another. A few others joined in slowly after him. Not everyone, but enough. Coulter's shoulders lowered like a man finally setting down something heavy. Outside, spring sunlight spilled gold across Dust River. For the first time since Vivian stepped off that stagecoach, Coulter reached for her openly in front of the whole world. And this time he didn't pull away. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with people long after the screen goes dark. Because deep down, most folks know what it feels like to stand where Vivian stood, carrying something the world notices before it notices your heart. And maybe some of us know what it feels like to stand where Coulter stood, too. Wanting love badly enough to ache for it, but fearing the loss that might come with it. Out on that little church floor in Dust River, neither of them became perfect people. They simply stopped hiding. Him from his grief, her from her scars. And sometimes that's the closest thing to healing a person ever gets. Not being rescued, not being fixed, just being chosen honestly. Maybe that's the real reason the old ranch finally felt like home by the end of the story. Not because the wind stopped blowing across Stone Creek, but because two lonely people finally decided to stay when leaving would been easier. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you were listening from tonight. And if you'd like, stay a while longer with this channel. There are still more forgotten towns, quiet cowboys, wounded hearts, and hard-won love stories waiting just down the trail.